All right, everyone. Good morning. My name is Aaron Blumberg, and I am SWFLN's Continuing Education Coordinator, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Accessibility Points, C is for Culture. We have a wonderful learning opportunity ready for you this morning with Christine Jewell. Christine Jewell has a PhD in American Studies, a Master's in Comparative Religion, and a Bachelor's in English and Religious Studies. She has spent the majority of her career in higher education, teaching humanities, religion, diversity in the United States, educational philosophy, and writing at a variety of institutions in Michigan and Florida. She also has experience working with nonprofit organizations and federal grant management, working to enhance services and resources for people with disabilities. She is a creativity and accessibility consultant, keynote speaker, and presenter. Please welcome Christine and enjoy her webinar this morning. Christine?
Okay, here I am. Everybody hearing me? Aaron, I just really want to thank you so much, and Diana and everyone for taking time out of your very busy day to spend some time thinking about accessibility, for such a kind introduction, and just, realizing that the layers of culture that are a part of accessibility and disability are complex. But I really appreciate your support, your interest in this topic. I'm seeing some names that are actually starting to sound familiar in the chat box or in the attendee list. So I really appreciate the opportunity, and these webinars are still a very new format for me. So I'm learning from each one and hopefully improving along the way. But again, I just want to express my gratitude for you for this opportunity. So this is, as Aaron mentioned, part of a series of accessibility points, and today we're going to be talking about the culture of compliance and the culture of gentleness. In the many ways both of these influence our patrons, ourselves, and our work. So I will be reading a lot of the slides. If you have attended some of these before, you'll know why, but I'm just going to say a quick point, because basically reading the slides makes them more accessible to people who are viewing these afterwards, and to people who perhaps may have visual impairments as well. So if that causes some repetition, I apologize for that, but I think that it's important to acknowledge the fact that we need to make webinars on accessibility as accessible as possible. I'm hoping someday to see captioning on here. I know SWFLN is moving forward on lots of fronts in this area, so hopefully that can work. If you could just take a second, and if you feel comfortable doing so, to just jot down in the chat box for me what kind of library that you work for, and if you did happen to see the first webinar in this series, A is for Accessibility, whether you attended in person or saw it afterwards, that might be just a little bit helpful for me. It doesn't matter really one way or the other, where you're from or if you have. It just gives me an idea maybe on who's coming and what I might need to repeat a little bit more, or if I could go faster in certain areas, like the beginning, and leave some more time for discussions and questions at the end. So go ahead and do that as I move forward, and I will try to both advance the webinar and talk about goals, and also read some of the comments at the same time, just so I can kind of get an idea of who is in here and where you're from and that sort of thing. So also at the same time, I know you're all multitaskers, so as you're writing that into the chat box and thinking about why you attended, if you could just, in your notes or even in the chat box if you want, what do you hope to gain from this webinar? Or another way, why are you attending this webinar? And is there a particular aspect about accessibility or disabilities that you would like to better address or understand? I see some comments coming through already about public libraries, and yes, you attended and you missed the first one. Academic libraries, awesome, thank you. Some academic libraries, yay, my peeps. My background, as Aaron mentioned, is in higher education and academics. So I'm grateful for a specialized library. Awesome. I'm grateful for this learning opportunity and my to expand my understanding of libraries and how they work in Southwest Florida. I moved down here about a year and a half ago, and it's been a very steep learning curve, but it's really good for me to learn and that you're here. So awesome. I appreciate your comments, and my goal is to make this as interactive as possible. I know that makes it more fun and interesting, but I'm still trying to get the balance on all of that and how that goes together. So if you received the email from Erin, you know that there are some handouts with this webinar, and I wanted to know you don't have to print them out for this webinar. They're just resources to help you as you increase your knowledge about accessibility and learn about the ways that you and your libraries can perhaps improve services to your patrons with disabilities and your patrons in general, your patrons without disabilities. Two of these are might be easy, quick prints. The first one, Nothing About Me Without Me, from Disability Rights Iowa, is only really a one-pager. And the last one, The 100 Ways to Be Gentle and Provide Care, which is loving and supportive, that is also another good one. The ADA primer there, the second one, that's a little bit longer. It is short by government standards, but it's a handbook on how to make small businesses accessible. And I know that it fits really well with the first one, webinar on accessibility, but I came across it after that webinar. So I just wanted to give you that as a resources. And I know that libraries are not necessarily small businesses. They may or may not be, not for profit. They do function in a lot of ways as them. So I just, in reading it, I thought that there were some helpful tips and guidelines in here. And the other ones too, there's some good things in there about people first language, plain language, good reminders as you strive for more accessibility and increased etiquette toward people with disabilities. So some good things there. And I like some of these comments here too, that you want to keep abreast of the new technologies and ideas being pursued. Yeah, that's awesome. Technologies, not so much in this webinar, but I will point you to some resources that will talk to technologies. This is going to be more of a kind of a philosophical or an attitudinal webinar, as you'll see in a few minutes. So in any case, these are my goals for the webinar, and again, there's a little bit of overlap in here, so I think there's a lot to learn by some overlap, but my goals are basically to provide brief reminders, very brief, SWFLN resources connected to accessibility, give you some definitions on accessibility, disability, and ableism to provide context for our discussion on cultures. I'm going to make an attempt to define the culture of compliance and how it negatively influences and creates risks. We're going to be talking about some risk factors, and some of them can get a little bit pushing on comfort zones perhaps. So I'm just kind of giving you a warning that there's some of the risk factors are not real cheery. Number 4, defining and explaining the culture of gentleness. Very briefly, 4 pillars, 4 tools, and how this philosophy of teaching can positively influence interactions with people with disabilities. And then, of course, at the end, I'm going to try to, depending on how much time we have, raise awareness and provide some tips and resources on disability and accessibility etiquette. The handouts hopefully give you some time for reflection. That last goal, I know that these webinars tend to take a little longer than I normally than I think they do when I'm creating them. So that last part, if we don't get to go into a lot of details there, that's okay. You'll have access to the webinar at the end, and Erin will post it on the SWFLN website, and you can revisit it in any place that you want. So again, very briefly, there are some webinars posted on SWFLN's website. These are recorded and resources. If you have not attended them, I strongly and highly recommend that you do. Providing and understanding some resources for patrons with disabilities, assisting patrons with disabilities. Again, even if you have attended or have seen them, you can always learn more from a rerun. Again, SWFLN's Diversity Discovery Institute webinars. Those are also wonderful. I think that there's a lot of overlaps both in the content and the relevancy to these webinars as well. And not just the ones that are immediately connecting, like the ones dealing with culture, we're dealing with culture. The ones on like perhaps inclusion or social justice or relationships, identity. Those are also extremely relevant to what we're talking about today too. And I think that these all connect to the idea of disability and accessibility. And it's just great to review and continually sharpen the tools in your professional toolkit. In reviewing for this one and preparing for this one, I always end up going back and taking a quick peek at some of these just to take a look at them. And they're wonderful resources for you and for anyone who wants to access SWFLN's website. So take a minute, just breathe, think about what the word accessibility means to you and all the things it may be connected to for you in your libraries. Again, I'm very grateful for you attending. This topic is very near and dear to my heart, and it actually comes at a very opportune time for me, as next week I'm going to be traveling to Washington, D.C. to do some work for the Office on Violence Against Women, which is part of the Department of Justice, and I'll be reviewing grant applications for collaborations who want to improve services for people with disabilities. This is pretty grueling work, but it always ends up recharging me because I get a sneak peek at what exciting and amazing things are happening on a national level for communities wanting to better serve people with disabilities. And this is also just kind of a reminder that whatever disability and accessibility means to you, however you end up at the end of this webinar, you don't have to reinvent the wheel on improving services or the areas that we're going to talk about today. So I will give you a link at the end that can help you connect with some of these national collaborations if you wanted, and to kind of join the conversations or at least see what conversations are happening and what resources are out there that you could avail yourself of. Whether there's policy and procedure review tools, there's safety and access review tools, there's all kinds of curriculum out there that might be relevant to your programs. So again, I'm happy to talk with you anytime with this in the future. I'm not hard to find. My contact information will be here at the end, and we will just go onward and forward here. So, broad definition of accessibility for the context of this webinar and kind of your libraries. A person served, person or patron, plus a disability. These can be visible or hidden, plus your library's response or your accommodation equals accessibility. And I want to just make a note here that accommodation does not necessarily mean a physical accommodation, especially for today's webinar. These are basically attitudinal barriers that we're going to be talking about. So you might have to make an attitudinal barrier adjustment as your accommodation. So, just kind of think about that in terms of what needs to be adjusted. What do our libraries do? What are our views on visible or hidden disabilities? Who are our patrons? Those are big, broad questions that we should be asking ourselves all the time because the answers are constantly changing. Okay, definitions of accessibility. Again, if you want more details, the first webinar went into that more, but I like this one because it's short and sweet. It's the degree to which someone can use something in his or her environment or society, has a common application in regard to people with disabilities, and access to a service or physical space. And I really think that this is, we could add the word culture at the end of that, access to a culture, because I think that that really is what we're talking about here, intersecting cultures. Okay, so just, again, feel free to, if you have your own definitions of accessibility, jot those down in your notes. Again, it's a process. It's a process of defining, and these definitions will change. Okay, disability, again, just trying to give everyone on a common ground. It's defined in a variety of ways. Some of the definitions are developed by professional organizations. They are used by disability groups and individuals with disabilities. They're used by government organizations and projects. Definitions can vary a lot. So I think, just being attentive to that fact, and that defining is kind of a moving target, so to speak. So, just be aware of what your definitions are, and you may kind of get some insights as to how you could improve services or, programs in your libraries. For this webinar, I want to just let you know where I am on the definition page with the idea of a disability, and that's from the World Health Organization definition. I like this one a lot, and this is the one I typically come back to and include in my webinars. A disability is not something that a person has, but it is something that occurs outside of the person. It's a functional limitation. Okay? Disability occurs in the interaction between the person, his or her functional ability, and the environment, including the physical, including communication, including information, and including social and policy environments. It really is, it's that interactive piece that you have to consider. The other reasons I like this definition is that I'm not in any way trying to minimize the fact that many people with disabilities visit our libraries every day. And I know that disabilities can be visible or hidden. I like these ideas because they help me remember that everyone is struggling with something. The World Health Organization definition emphasizes function over diagnosis. It equalizes the physical and mental functional limitations. It's an ordinary part of experience for all people, and the experience of disability can be minimized by the environments designed to accommodate varying functional abilities. And I just think it's important, because what you learn in today's webinar, while it is most definitely intended to help you, particularly with patrons with disabilities, it does apply to everyone. We are all disadvantaged at times. We all struggle with complying with situations or people or clashes that, make our values conflict with others. We all need help. We all could use a little kindness and gentleness and encouragement once in a while, right? So while I'm hoping you gain some specific knowledge here, I'm also hoping you learn some things that are more broadly applicable in your professional and even personal lives. Some of this will push on some of those personal and professional boundaries, just letting you know. In this one, the last one too, again, this is the root cause. This is our real culprit. This is the real enemy, ableism. It's a pervasive system of discrimination and exclusion that oppresses people with disabilities. It's a system in which people without disabilities maintain supremacy over people with disabilities through a set of attitudes, that's mainly what we're going to talk about today, behaviors, social structures, rewards, privileges, and benefits of the society that are available to individuals according to their presumed level of ability. Okay? And just so you know, ableism operates on individual, organizational, institutional, cultural, and societal levels. Okay? All those levels are incorporated. So again, I'm hoping that because it's complex, it's dealing with culture, you will find some things that are useful on many levels. Okay, so this slide, I'm sure you've seen this before. I have used it before. I know Deetta Jones has used it before. It's a good metaphor. We are in the deep and dark part of this cultural iceberg metaphor here. We are in the beliefs and assumptions, perceptions, attitudes, and really feelings area as well. And if you take a look at the metaphor, what we do on a day-to-day basis, where we get things done, that is at the top of the iceberg, and it's really only the tip. But it has to be connected, or at least we should be striving to make it connected to our values and our perceptions and our attitudes, and understanding how these things interact. And I know sometimes in this there are disconnects in this cultural iceberg, but I think it's a good reminder of how we are trying to get things done. And also, nothing about culture changes or moves quickly. Okay? We're going to get these done at our own pace. It's an ongoing process, and I think that we have to just kind of keep that in mind, be patient, give ourselves some slack. I think the culture of gentleness will give you some perhaps tools that you have already. You don't even have to buy them or or anything. You have the 4 tools already at your disposal. It's just a matter of how you perceive them and think about them. That will help. So again, culture, think about that. And of course, those of you who know me or are getting to know me through these webinars or other SWFLN events, you know that I love diagrams. I don't want to disappoint, so I had to put a diagram in here. This is how and where I see today's webinar intersecting with you and your library's culture. Okay, so we have the Venn diagram there. We have 3 intersecting circles of library culture, the culture of compliance, and the culture of gentleness. Now, we're striving for that sweet spot in the center where we can take our existing library culture, and please know that could be policies, that could be procedures, that could be physical or attitudinal environment. We're taking the knowledge of some of the constraints and the dangers of the culture of compliance and the risk factors it creates, and the response or the positive aspects that the culture of gentleness can create. It's rare, I think, and probably one of the reasons I like Venn diagrams so much, that we can find that balance in that center, that we can find a centered position. Our days and our worlds move very quickly, but I like the diagram because it gives us something to strive for. Okay, so all of that is basically really set up and context and introduction to this webinar. So this is the short version slide. It's very complex. Okay, what we're going to be doing here is creating some awareness of a barrier and a perception, creating awareness of the culture of compliance as one of many attitudinal barriers that people with disabilities face. This is pushing on hidden dimensions of disability and therefore accessibility. It's raising awareness perhaps, or at least getting you to a point where you can think about who your community partners and what your relationships that you have perhaps already established that can help your understanding and move your libraries forward. It's also advocating for a deeper knowledge of your patrons and your community demographics. At the end, I'm going to give you just a very brief snapshot of some of the demographics in SWFLN's service area. Maybe give you some ideas of resource and training that are available. Certainly the culture of gentleness, there's trainings available for that if you want, or you could just perhaps on your own do some research and you can take some of the resources that they have on their website to help your libraries. And again, I just want to express it's not a one-size-fits-all solution here. This is an ongoing process, and what I'm hoping to do with these accessibility points webinars is to start conversations, to help people raise questions and be able to get a better foundation perhaps of where those conversations might need to happen at your libraries and in your service and your programs and your policies. So there's many ways I think that you can get some value out of this complexity, but just so you know, it is complex. Okay, so the culture of compliance and some other attitudinal barriers. So here is the beginning. I want to start with a working definition of the culture of compliance. It is an attitudinal barrier that socially conditions people with disabilities to be more compliant in order to receive services, resources, caregiving, attention, or relationships. Compliance is often reinforced through primary caregivers offering rewards, granting special privileges, giving added praise, attention, and/or access to resources. The culture of compliance is a subculture within an already complex system of socialization barriers and hidden dimensions of discrimination that people with disabilities face. The culture of compliance increases risks of danger and violence. It perpetuates ableism, and it often prohibits people with disabilities from making individual and authentic choices in all areas of daily living. Okay? A couple of thoughts that might not leap out at you at this point. In the context of this definition, I view you as professional librarians, as public servants in public institutions or academic institutions. I view you as seekers. Okay, you're attending this webinar. You're looking to improve your knowledge base and understanding. I view you as givers and helpers in this ever-changing culture of knowledge and information and technology. I view you as caregivers. That word may not be particularly comfortable, but I know in the context of this definition, caregiver also refers to people who may be permanently or temporarily taking care of a person with a disability. And you are, in whatever capacity that you interact with in your libraries, interacting with people who are influenced by, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, by the culture of compliance. And to circle back to a minute to the point that on many levels we all have disabilities of some sort or at some time. So the culture of compliance applies to everyone because we are interacting with the ableism that exists. Another way to think about this definition, I know it's long and it's a lot to absorb at first, but it's kind of a go along to get along type of attitude. And we all have experience with that, right? A situation arises and something is not right, whatever, fill in the blank, but to make the peace, to move forward, to get some sort of resolution, we cave. We cave a little. We give in a little. We comply. We sacrifice a little bit of what we think the way things should go to make them actually go. The culture of compliance is like that. And these things do not seem to be, usually at the beginning, completely wrong or harmful things. But as I mentioned before, this is culture we're dealing with, and culture is complicated. I want you to think about just a little bit. I think this might help you frame some of this. Synonyms for compliant or being compliant. Okay? Acquiescent, obedient, submissive, yielding, amenable, accommodating, conforming, compatible, passive, or docile. And depending on the context and what that is, in and of themselves, some of these words really don't seem to be too bad or harmful, right? We have to give in and compromise. We have to try to get along with shared goals and in shared working environments, right? I'm just trying to raise awareness here about the culture of compliance and that some of those attitudes can be very slippery slopes. And we are often very quick to make a judgment, to assess a situation, to react to a particular request or a patron without a conscious, or perhaps a better word here, conscientious attention to the deeper awareness of that person, asking the person who we are serving what that person experiences on a day-to-day basis, how that person is labeled, categorized, treated, understood, or misunderstood. Okay? I love this picture. You may be familiar with it at all. The little girl is saying, I have amazing eyes, an infectious laugh. I always know when you need a hug. And then it's at the bottom, I also have Down syndrome. It's a part of me, not a definition of who I am. I really think that this is important because how we define, how we frame a person, that impacts and feeds into the culture of compliance. I want to share a story, and I may have shared it in the first webinar. I don't remember exactly, but my son Talon, he is 32. He has a developmental disability and called Fragile X syndrome, And he loves libraries. And this has always been fascinating to me, especially when creating these webinars, because part of Fragile X syndrome is Talon can't read. And my perception of libraries is that libraries are places where you go to get information and books, and I know that he can get audio and video and that sort of thing, but he, I had a sense that he liked going to the library for other reasons, and we've been using some of the apps that they've used in some of the other webinars. He has a text-to-speech app on his phone now that will read him text. He is absolutely delighted with that. And he's, kind of learning to absorb to read, but the reality is his brain is not wired like our brain. The synapses are different, and he just seeing a word on a page may or may not connect to a word in his experience or his understanding. So when I asked him, Talon, what do you like so much about libraries? He just looked at me like I was kind of silly, and he's like, well, people at libraries are nice to me. And that just tweaked my heart. I mean, that is just absolutely warms my heart that he has experienced libraries like that. And I think that we have to, remember that those attitudes that people experience in our library, they can discriminate against people, or they can empower people. And with or without disabilities, again, I know in this context it's disabilities, but it's broader. And sometimes if we're not going through our day and intentionally being aware and thinking about our attitudes and how we are coming across to people on a positive or a negative level, we're not going to be able to change. We're not going to be able to grow. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why I wanted to give you two examples of two different kinds of cultures, positive and negative. So, with that in mind, culture of compliance is an attitudinal barrier, and I want to talk about other attitudinal barriers that you will hopefully get an idea of how complex that this culture of compliance is, and really how complex the attitudinal barriers that people with disabilities face can be. And I want to emphasize can be. Okay, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all and answers to everything webinar. Every patron, every person you serve on a daily basis is individual, and people may or may not be struggling with these barriers. Okay, the first one on this slide, again, these are attitudinal barriers that people with disabilities face that intersect with the culture of compliance or could be self-standing. The first one, inferiority. Because a person can be impaired in one area of life's major functions, some people believe that that individual is a second-class citizen. However, most people with disabilities have skills that make the impairment moot or irrelevant in the workplace. I think that this is important, but there's really this is a quick snap judgment that people make based on usually a disability you can see. Okay, you see a person in a wheelchair. You can see that a person has Down syndrome. For some people, this puts that person immediately into that other category. That this person is different than me. I do not have a disability, therefore I am better than, or this person is less than me. Again, I'm not saying this is the case for everyone, and I can actually assume the exact opposite because you are attending this webinar. You are trying to increase your knowledge and understanding about accessibility. Therefore, you probably don't do most of these at all, but I'm trying to raise awareness of them so that you can kind of understand the layer upon layer of barriers. But let's look at some others. Again, I'm not trying to say that you guys participate in these barriers. Another attitudinal response is pity. People will feel sorry for the person with a disability, which tend to lead to patronizing attitudes. People with disabilities generally don't want pity and charity, just an equal opportunity to earn their own way and live independently. Again, this is not, some people do want pity and charity. Some people aren't interested in opportunities. They're interested in exploiting, the system to get whatever they can out of it. The nuance is that people with disabilities are no different than people really without disabilities, because we're all human. We're all struggling to to kind of get in that. It's complex, right? And there's emotions involved in this pity one as well. Even after years, I struggle with this one on some day, just a little, but here's a kind of a thought. Where are the lines between pity, and this is in this context a questionable attitudinal barrier, where are the lines between pity and empathy? Okay, that's a shameless plug for an upcoming diversity webinar, but I'm just trying to raise awareness here for attitudinal barriers and how they're complex. There isn't, like a particular line that, okay, now I'm in pity and now I'm in empathy. There's gray areas in between all of these. Perhaps another one at the opposite end of pity is hero worship. Okay, this one is difficult too. We are all inspired, or we can be, by many people in stories each day. Hero worship would, be a person considering someone who has a disability, who lives independently, or pursues a profession, that they are brave or they're special. Okay, there's another plug further on the way that we're going to talk about special needs in another one. They're somehow special for overcoming a disability. But most people with disabilities do not want accolades for performing day-to-day tasks. The disability is there. The individual has simply learned to adapt by using his or her skills and knowledge, just as everybody adapts to being tall, being short, strong, fast, easygoing, bald, blonde, etc. Just another characteristic. Something to think about there. And I think that in and of itself, having heroes is a good thing. I mean, my goodness, we need to have some heroes. We need to be heroes. Sometimes we are heroes, and we don't even realize it. The nuance here, though, is that you admire the person because they have the disability. And that's really defining that person by their disability. And again, that creates barriers and to our service and our attitude toward people with disabilities. Perhaps not, ginormous barriers, but again, it can happen. Okay, the spread effect. This is one you might not have necessarily thought of, but I've seen it interacted so many times. I've been a Special Olympics coach for years and years and years, and this happens all the time to people who are new, volunteers with wonderful hearts who come to Special Olympics. But people assume that an individual's disability negatively affects other senses, other abilities, or personality traits, or that the total person is impaired. For example, many people shout at people who are blind, or don't expect people who are using wheelchairs to have the intelligence to speak for themselves. Focusing on a person's abilities rather than his or her disability can counter this type of prejudice. Again, you just can't make assumptions. The spread effect is based a lot of times on visible disabilities. But once you start talking to a person, again, you might come into contact with hidden disabilities or invisible disabilities, mental illness, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's all kinds of, Alzheimer's, memory loss. There could be all kinds of things that you cannot see, heart conditions, physical disabilities or intellectual developmental disabilities that you can't see. Again, I hate to keep using my son Talon. Okay, I don't. I love using him. I love bragging about him as an example. But Fragile X is a cognitive and developmental disability. Physically, to look at Talon, you cannot see that there is a thing wrong with him. He's, that he has any disability whatsoever. He is 6'3", he's in great shape, he runs marathons, he plays sports, he's got a great sense of humor. But once you start talking to him a little bit, you'll be able to sense that, that he's struggling with communication in certain areas, that he sees things, a little bit differently, which is a good thing. He has the ability to bring the best out in people. But again, people may, once they know that, make assumptions on him and assume that, just because he has cognitive limitations, that he can't do things. It doesn't really work that way, and we have to treat everyone as an individual. Stereotypes, okay, so another side of this is stereotypes, and the opposite side of the spread effect is that positive and negative generalizations about people positive and negative generalizations people form about disabilities. So, these could be good or bad. They might believe that all people who are blind are great musicians or have a keener sense of smell and hearing. That people who use wheelchairs are docile. Again, some of those words coming up. Or that they compete in Paralympics, or that all people with developmental disabilities are innocent and sweet, or that all people with disabilities are sad and bitter. Okay, again, aside from diminishing the individual and his or her abilities, this sort of prejudice can set a too high or too low of a standard for individuals who are human. Okay, we're humans. I think it's important, and there's really no hard and fast rule about what constitutes an attitudinal barrier. But one suggestion I have, maybe it's two. Number one, be aware of how you feel about or have an attitude about a particular person or situation. A lot of times we're not even aware that we have feelings or attitudes about people. Sometimes we are very aware that we have attitudes and feelings about people. Try to be more conscious of that. And then, number two, try to determine or become aware of how and why you developed that feeling and attitude. The only way I think that we can combat ableism is to become aware of how we ourselves are perpetuating these stereotypes and try to eliminate them in ourselves. And then, of course, maybe ask questions about the way we see those stereotypes manifesting in our institutions, in our organizations. Okay? Another attitudinal barrier, backlash. Many people believe individuals with disabilities are given unfair advantages, such as easier work requirements. Employers need to hold people with disabilities to the same job standards as coworkers although the means of accomplishing the task may differ from person to person. The ADA does not require special privileges for people with disabilities. It just requires equal opportunities. And I think that this is really important. That last sentence there is the key. You're not required to give special privileges to people with disabilities, just equal opportunities. And that, again, is going to put that in the context of your libraries. You have to raise some difficult questions. Does a person who is blind have the same opportunities as someone who is seeing? What about a person who is deaf? Can both of these access all of your programs, your catalogs, your databases, or alternatives? Or do you need to make accommodations in some way? And how? I can't, put a one-size-fits-all answer on there again, I'm sorry, but I wish I could. I wish it'd be easier, but, these are things to ask. And again, kind of remember the nothing without me, or nothing about me without me sort of handout that we gave. The people with the disabilities are your best resources. If someone is using your library and you know that they are struggling with a disability of some sort, the best thing to do is ask them, how can we help you? Do you need, how is our service? Get the information that you need directly from the source. I think that that's really important to think about, that your best resources are your patrons, the people that you are using. And also the idea that, all of these, even though the definitions didn't really think about that, they also apply to the employer-employee aspect. We know that there's great gaps in employing people with disabilities in our libraries and really in all of our organizations. So think about that as well. How can we attract people with disabilities to come work with us? That's a way that could seriously help you make great strides in improving your services by that. Another one, denial. Okay, again, these are attitudinal barriers. Many disabilities are hidden, such as learning disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, epilepsy, cancer, arthritis, heart conditions. People tend to believe that these are not legitimate or bona fide disabilities needing accommodation. But that ADA definition, and if you want to go back to that first webinar, we went into that in a lot more detail. They define disability as an impairment that substantially limits one of the major life activities. So accommodating, in other words, not denying, hidden dimensions of disabilities can keep valued employees on the job and open doors for new employees and patrons. So it's really, think about the ways that denial, it's a big one. It points directly to the complexities of attitudinal barriers. I think it also indicates why attitudinal barriers are the most difficult barriers to overcome. And I think that the barriers really apply to both the people we serve and to our relationships with our coworkers. And I think that the definition of ableism, which is the root of all these barriers, discrimination can be on an individual, organizational, institutional, cultural, or societal level. Again, we are masters at denial. We are masters at not seeing, and that's one of the goals. I hope that, just to raise awareness of some of the ways that we do this. And then, of course, just the last one, and this is really an underlying barrier to a lot of areas of life: fear. Many people are afraid that they will do or say the wrong thing around someone with a disability. They therefore, try to avoid their own discomfort and avoid that individual with a disability. It's the same sort of idea of meeting a person from a different culture. If you continually and frequently encounter people with disabilities, this will raise your comfort level with that. And I think it takes courage. We're going to talk in the next one about accessibility points, about courage and what that actually looks like. It takes courage to admit that you have been afraid, or that you've had some uncomfortableness, or that you've been denial or in denial, or you've experienced some of these attitudinal barriers. That takes courage, and I think that it's important to be able to move on through that, and that often to understand that these barriers overlap, they intersect. Okay, so at the heart of this issue, of culture of compliance, it's increased risk. Okay, if serving patrons with disabilities, if you as librarians, if those serving patrons with disabilities are going to be successful in identifying and eliminating situations that cause people with disabilities to be discriminated against, you must have an understanding of what causes the discrimination, and then you have to make a plan for responding to it. Individuals with disabilities, I think I missed a word there, sorry about that. Individuals with disabilities are more vulnerable to becoming victims of crime, abuse, and neglect. This is the heart of this issue here. I'm going to say it again. Individuals with disabilities are more vulnerable to becoming victims of crime, abuse, and neglect. Many function daily with an increased risk of danger, even from very well-meaning people. And so we're going to talk about some of these risks and guidelines in the next couple slides to help you better serve and understand serve patrons with disabilities, and better understand some of those hidden dimensions of disabilities and what barriers folks face. And I think that getting back to the specific idea of the culture of compliance, people with disabilities, remember, these can be physical, intellectual, or cognitive, emotional, hidden, visible. They're at increased risk because they often have to comply with caregivers in order to get the basic services or access to those services. That idea of compliance is the heart of it, and it's scary. That middle line is scary a little bit, and I cannot go into the scope of it in this webinar, but the data that we have on national and state levels, and to a lesser extent we have data on local levels, but it indicates that people with disabilities are so much more vulnerable, up to 4 or 5 times more vulnerable. They experience violence at much higher levels than people without disabilities. And part of this is that elusive nature of this culture of compliance. So I'm going to spend some time, kind of digging into some of those risk factors at this point, and those risk factors that perpetuate the culture of compliance. And again, I'm an academic, so I'm kind of having a little bit of struggle with this. I'm not trying to say that these will definitely indicate risk factors, but they may perpetuate the culture of compliance. So there's mays all over here. Okay, so again, treat people as individuals, but think about these as potential risk factors. Okay, many people with disabilities have restricted social environments. Okay, many feel powerless. Okay, many may depend upon touch for personal care and may not always be able to control the nature of the care or the touch physically, cognitively, or verbally. People with disabilities may be socialized to accept being touched by anyone, especially someone mysteriously called staff. Okay, if you're thinking about perhaps some of your patrons with disabilities who live in group homes or nursing homes, perhaps. This could be a risk factor. People with disabilities may be unable to differentiate between appropriate and inappropriate actions, and therefore they're uncertain as to what constitutes abuse or risky behavior. They may or may not understand the concept of strangers. Okay? And I think about really to understand these slides and these risk factors, you really have to think a little bit deeper about where your patrons may live. Who do they interact with? Who takes care of them or helps them get the services they need? Sometimes patrons with disabilities may be accompanied into your library by a caregiver, but you can't assume that the person who accompanies them is the caregiver either. It's tricky. Okay, person first, nothing without me, or nothing about me without me. Guidelines apply. These risk factors may also apply to an elderly person, a person who has mental illness or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. They have an intellectual disability, or live in a sheltered environment. The key, I think, is to build relationships with your patrons and to get to know them, to keep these attitudinal barriers in mind, and you'll learn how to better serve each person as an individual. And again, I know that a lot of these may be negative, but we have culture of gentleness coming up in a minute, and that will also give you some tips with that. Okay, a few more risk factors. People with disabilities may not be able to conceive of the fact that someone they know would harm them. They may not have received sex education. They may be particularly disadvantaged by communication barriers and unable to tell others about the abuse or discrimination. They may rely on others for decision making in their best interest in most cases, or they may live or work in a situation where compliant behavior is required and considered normal. You might have heard of the phrase no means no. Well, a lot of times, no means you're fired. And if you don't comply, you can find another job, and that's a huge area for a lot of people with disabilities. They have difficulties finding employment, so they're trapped in a job that is not safe or healthy for them, and that can be dangerous. Again, I can't really go into the harm and the abuse aspects too much here. I do have a lot of data and stats. Some of the links I'm going to give you at the end, or the resources, can lead you there if you want to access that or learn about that. But just brief, broad examples here. Consider examples of outings, or sometimes they're called community days or community-based interaction. You may have seen or experienced. Some nursing homes or assisted living centers or group homes for people with disabilities, whether those be intellectual or developmental or physical, have specific days designated in their programming and services to take their residents out. They go out to the library, they go out to a grocery store, they go out to the mall, and then they load everybody up in buses and off they go. In general, this is a good thing. But what if somebody wants to go to the library or the store or the mall on a different day? They're probably out of luck. They have to comply with the system and the schedule or miss the opportunity. Or sometimes these outings can be used as punishments or rewards. If you don't comply, you're not going to get to go to the library next week. Or if you don't comply, the whole group is going to the mall, you're not going to get to go. Okay, those can be factors that force people into the culture of compliance, and they have to, in order to access basic services, they have to comply. Another one too, finally, this is the last slide of these. Many individuals with disabilities are highly dependent on their caregivers for daily care. This may make them reluctant to report abuse. They might be afraid of retribution. For example, more abuse, they get threatened to be put in a home, or they get more privileges taken away. Some family members or guardians of individuals with disabilities may have a false sense of security about the safety of their loved ones who may or may not be in those institutions. They think that they're safer in supervised settings. We know that this is really not the case. The last point, says, depending on other people for care, money, medications, access to resources increases the chance for threats, isolation, and manipulation. The data indicates that the violence and abuse that is most likely, and it's an awful amount, it's between 93 and 98% depending on your source. 93 and 98% of the time, the abuse and the violence comes from a family member or a known caregiver. It's not stranger danger. Okay, that's another issue, but it happens, but it's mostly coming from a known caregiver. And so just by reading through some of these risk factors, you can see how emotionally complex each of these situations could be. So I know that this is kind of depressing. So we're going to shift now to culture of gentleness. Again, I'm dumping a lot of things at you, but I want you to be able to have some tools to be able to go through that. And again, these are two competing cultures. Picture that Venn diagram. We're going to move on and then hold your own library culture in mind. And again, at any time, I know that the chat box has been a little bit quiet, but if you have questions or you want to add anything into the chat box, feel free to go. But onward to something a little bit more positive here. So the culture of gentleness, what is it? I struggle with putting a definition slide together because it's many things. It's a philosophy. It's a way of life for a lot of wonderful folks I know back in Michigan. It's a teaching strategy, gentle teaching. I'm going to try to define it and explain it in about 5 slides. Okay? So I learned about it. I was trained in it, not extensively, but initial 2-day training workshop and a day-long conference. I'm still trying to learn it. Okay, but basically it comes from a place, and I'm giving you this website 3 different times, here a little bit later, and then in the resources, from a place called the Center for Positive Living Supports. And if you go to this website, they have tons of resources on here, what kind of trainings are available, how you can register. They have trainers who will travel and come out to you. I'm not sure. I know when I left Michigan about 1.5 years ago, they were struggling, like all nonprofits do, but it's I think that you could probably get a lot of information or start reading some of the resources out there, and maybe you can figure out, a way to kind of decide what training might be best for you as an individual or your libraries. So brief history, it was a response to when Michigan closed the last public institution for people with developmental disabilities in Mount Pleasant. It's right in the middle of the mitten, if you're not familiar with Michigan. In 2009, it was advocated and created by the Center for Positive Living Supports. It resulted in statewide training in individual crisis response. So basically what this was is they have a lot more training on here. They run conferences. It's frequently asked questions. There's success stories, people to connect and contact with. But the Center for Positive Living Supports for many years in Michigan was in charge of doing all the training for the disability service providers in the state. So when they closed the institutions in Michigan, people with disabilities needed a place to go. So Michigan's response to this was to create disability service provider organizations. I haven't found the counterpart yet for this in Florida. I think Florida is, from what I can see so far, I have a limited time down here of exploring, but I think you're a little bit behind the curve compared to Michigan in terms of what supports and living situations you have available for people with disabilities. And I think it's an idea we're spreading, and I think that it had a huge impact on the state of Michigan. And hopefully, maybe this webinar can start some initial conversations about how maybe we can spread this idea of culture of gentleness. Okay, the primary creator of it was a man named Dr. John McGee. He created these principles and teaching tenets of gentle teaching. And these are core principles that are really grounded in a psychology of human interdependence. That's a key word, and I'm going to go over that in a second. But really what they're doing here is caregivers and care providers look at themselves and their spirit of gentleness in order to find ways to express warmth and unconditional valuing toward those who are the most excluded from family and community life. Okay? It's really, the context of this webinar would be any person with a disability or anyone who has experienced these attitudinal barriers resulting from ableism or discrimination based on their ability. And I just want to recall that, my perception of you, and, I'm thinking about my son and the story about how he loves libraries because you folks are nice to him, that you are caregivers. Okay, you are caregivers, and really sharing information, knowledge, resources, community interaction. This is what libraries do. This is caring for people. You're caring for their minds. You're caring for their growth and learning. You're helping them. Okay, I think that where some of the words that the culture of gentleness use may be a little bit, you're not used to those, or you might consider them a little bit unprofessional. I really see this is what you're doing. And there's also some Florida state statutes that indicate, from my perspective, that the state is actually expecting you to do this. They're letting themselves off the hook, I think, and pushing it on individual organizations. But I'll show you that in a second. So the culture of gentleness, it views the role of caregiver, you can substitute library staff person or volunteer or research assistant or whatever your role is, as critical and requires a deep commitment to personal, organizational, and social change. And I've kind of changed the last point there just to be specific, just to have you think about it. Libraries that establish a deep sense of community and companionship with those we serve, and again, this could be people with disabilities or without disabilities, you create a foundation for meaningful living. Okay? I think that it's really important for you to remember that and to realize that you have a huge role and impact on people every single day. Okay? Again, we're still kind of trying to define it and explain it, the culture of gentleness. I think that the central purpose of your presence, our presence, the people who follow the culture of gentleness in the lives of others, is to nurture, to teach, and sustain experiences of connectedness, companionship, community. In the trainings, they call these the 3 C's, and you get it from all kinds of different angles, ways to explain how you're connected, how you're companions, and how you're a part of a community. Okay, and I think that the principles of the culture of gentleness and gentle teaching stress the importance of relationships in recovery and of learning. Okay, I know I'm dumping a lot at you, but hopefully you can go back and take a look at this later. But what we're really trying to talk about here is a fundamental paradigm shift in attitudes about disabilities. Okay, the left-hand column from to the right-hand column to, we're shifting from a focus on disability and the individual to a focus on ability and interdependence. You're changing, you're shifting from a focus on control and consequences to a focus on unconditional respect. You're focusing on actions or activities that will lead to self-reliance to actions or activities that lead to companionship and community. And I understand that, not all the things on the left-hand sides are harmful in and of themselves. Sometimes self-reliance is a good thing, but also sometimes forcing someone to be self-reliant, forcing them to live independently can be very isolating. Okay, again, individual aspects, but on some days, I'm not sure that on any given day we are thinking about paradigm shifts in our libraries. But I just want you to think about the fact that, libraries serve a lot of different functions for a lot of different people. I am very grateful. I have used libraries all my life. They have been very safe places for me to learn and grow. I know libraries mean different things to different people, and I think that the culture of gentleness can offer a way to expand the scope of our libraries and better serve and reach out to people with disabilities. It's a process. It's a work in progress. Again, on any given day, I know we have all we can handle just by getting by and through all the million things we have to do. The culture of gentleness is a philosophy, though. It's a way of being in those busy days that can transform the crazy and the stressful into the peaceful and the empowering. So I think that, it's how does it work? Okay, how does it work? There's four main principles. They call them the four main pillars of the culture of gentleness, and these are them. Okay, so number one, there's safety in our relationships and our environment. Simple, plain and simple. You are safe with me. Safety is got to be first. Again, connecting back to that culture of compliance and all the dangers and the risk factors that people with disabilities may face. Safety is first. You're safe. Number two, being valued or loved and supported by those who care about us. The ability to accept caring, the ability to, experience being valued. Okay. Number three, valuing and loving others and of trusting relationships. Giving back to others and to the community. Number four, engagement and interdependence with others. We are all in this together. Creating circles of support as an important element to recovery and learning. I think it's, these are the four pillars. So, safe, loved, loving, and engaged is kind of the short version. And I have to say I understand side comment about love. Okay. If using the word love is uncomfortable for you in a library setting, if it pushes against your professional boundaries, that is okay. Okay, don't worry about it. You can have substitutes. Use respected, valued or valuable, appreciated. You can find another word. The ultimate point is increased accessibility and meaningful interaction with people with disabilities. We have many words we can use. I myself have been trying to focus on the love part because that pushes at some academic and uncomfortable boundaries for me, to say, I love my students, or I love, I'm not sure. Sometimes I don't love my students. But, just why are we uncomfortable with it? Go back to that idea of how and why did I develop this attitude that it's not okay to love somebody? And I get it. There's layers upon culture, but what is being reinforced? When we have this basic capacity for that. I get that. But just so you know. All right. So, and I want to also talk about here for a second. I'm going to put the slide up because I'm going to try to make sure we get to this. But I want to talk a second about that word interdependence for a second. And this is just an idea that the pillars work on this foundation. And this is from a book by John McGee. Again, he created this thing it's called Mending Broken Hearts. You can find this as a downloadable PDF on the webinar. So I think, on the internet. So if you want it and you want to read a little bit more about that, again, Mending Broken Hearts. And interdependence for McGee is an acceptance of the whole person, mind, body, and spirit. I know we don't often think about that as our role in libraries, but this is what he means by interdependence. It is a recognition of companionship and community as the most basic values in caregiving and service. Okay, you might not think about that. Your most basic values might be fast and expedient information giving, or resources, putting resources in your patrons' hands. But he's saying, nope, it's really about companionship and community. I have to connect with those basic values. Interdependence is a belief that all persons, all people, again, with disabilities, without disabilities, they hunger for a feeling of being one with other people. We are not disconnected. We are not islands. We have more that is in common with each other than is different. Interdependence is based on an understanding that fear and meaninglessness create and drive violence toward ourselves and towards others. Fear and meaninglessness create isolation and create a deep sense of worthlessness. I know you can feel these currents running through the cultures at this point, that, oh my goodness, it's, life is meaningless, or worthless, or, how are we going to survive these times? And it's a matter of focus, okay? Interdependence is also has a focus on teaching feelings of being safe, loved, loving, and engaged. Again, those are the pillars. And it's really, interdependence is really a way that indicates that we believe that unconditional love is our way of being. And again, don't get hung up on love. Unconditional acceptance is a way of being. Unconditional respect is our way of being. You can work through this if you don't like the language. Okay, so how do we do this? How do we do this? And here, this is how we do it. The 4 tools. And you have all these tools. It's so simple. It's so basic that this is how we do it. And again, I know that there's going to be some resistance with number 4, but the 4 tools are our presence, our words, our eyes, and our touch. And I'm just going to go through and explain those a little bit in that order. And maybe you can see some of those examples and really think about your interactions with your patrons. What have been the most meaningful and satisfying interactions that you have had with your patrons? What have been the most meaningful and satisfying interactions with your coworkers? Why do you continue doing what you do each day? I'm betting that it's these meaningful interactions and these meaningful relationships that you're forming, in addition to the work that you do. I mean, work is work. We all have to work. We have jobs to do. Most of us like some of it, don't like some of it. But, using these 4 tools, or being aware or conscientious and conscious of how you use these 4 tools can add a whole nother layer of meaning and value to your daily work. So the first tool, presence. Okay, our greatest gift to any person is our time and undivided attention. I know it's difficult. Undivided attention, I'm not even sure that really exists. We are fragmented. We think multitasking. We're always doing, many things on many levels. But presence is really all about consciously trying to give, your presence to another person. Okay? By presence, we mean that we enter the space where the person, again, with or without a disability, is at. Not where you want them to be. And we're in customer service. You might want them to be quickly out of your way and so you can be on to the next person in line. I get that. But entering a person's space where that person is, really being with that person and not where you want them to be is essential to understanding and using this tool. Be aware of your presence by being calming, relaxed, supportive, compassionate, generous, fearless, humble. I know, again, this is very difficult, but these attitudes, this presence, they're contagious. Okay, did the attitudes webinar a while ago. They're contagious. When you're constantly around stressful, angry, rushed people, you're going to be stressful, angry, and rushed. If you can be that presence, if you can be calm, supportive, compassionate, you are going to pull that out. You are going to mirror that. You are going to be that for other people. And then they will look at that and say, whoa, I can do that too. And then they'll contribute to that relaxed, supportive, compassionate, generous, fearless, humble attitude and presence. It can transform. I can see it transform. My experience with this is mostly with people who are disability service providers and only work with people with disabilities. So, I know that you serve many kinds of patrons, but, just think about presence. Okay? Be intentional about cultivating these skills of presence. Okay? Second tool, words. Okay, things to think about. Rhythm, tone, warmth. Be in the moment. Keep the dialogue here and now. Use kind, soft, non-violent words. I'm going to in a future webinar, have a whole list of violent words that we're not always even aware of. Even the idea of, I have to laugh when I look at the slide. If you notice, I use squares. I don't use bullet points. Bullet points, okay? That connotes a lot of different dangers there. But again, we have a lot of violence in our culture, and a lot of times we don't even realize that the words we're using is violent. Speak of good things that honor and uplift the person. And again, person first language. Handouts from the previous webinar will help with that. Eyes. Eyes are the window to the soul and can be used as or in place of hands. With those of you who may fear or are uncomfortable with touch, which is the last one. I'm kind of trying to rev you up here for that one. Recognize that the person may see your eyes as fists. And you know how we do that. A glance, a nasty little look at somebody. We can shut somebody down instantly with a look. So, culture of gentleness, the tools are saying go slowly, go softly. Your gaze should be soft, loving, slow. Be kind and warm. Just think about it. Just think about it and know that your eyes can communicate volumes. And when you meet somebody and you actually look at their eyes and they're not there, right? We do that all the time. That gets back to the presence. Are you there? Are you present at work? Are you using your eyes to say to people, I am here for you. I am here to help you. You are safe with me. This is where this is going. Now, touch. I know this is going to be resistant to a lot of people, and it's okay. Don't even worry about it. I know it's going to push on boundaries. My experience with this was working with a sexual assault service provider, the YWCA in Michigan. I was working with therapists and social workers and nurses, and they were like, no way, we can't use this as a tool. It's okay. Make a note of your discomfort. Make a note of your resistance, and if you can use 3 of these tools or 2 or even 1 on any given day, you can make a difference, but I want to make sure you have it. Okay, touch can be used as a concrete sign of love, and it can teach abstractions such as friendship, caring, and kindness. It's okay to avoid touch if it conflicts with that person's life story, culture, or religious beliefs. Again, it's getting back to knowing your patrons, knowing what they can do and what they need and what they want. When using touch, if you are doing so, do so softly, slowly, predictably. Be ready to back off at any moment. I remember in one of the trainings, one of the trainers had said, you touch with angel wings. Okay, you touch with angel wings. Okay, touch, sometimes you don't even have to touch. Sometimes it's, it's just the idea that you're close and your hands are close, or that you're not, backing away in fear from somebody because they have that presence, that, position can almost be used as touch for some folks. And then just remember that you are dealing and working in the space of fear. Move or touch quietly, carefully, slowly, intentionally. Okay? So I want to give you again the opportunity to encourage some reflections or discussions. What aspects, don't think we're done. We're not quite done. I have more stuff for you, but I want to give you an idea just to reflect or ask some questions if you have about these, and go ahead and feel free to put those in the chat box and I can see them. Or again, I know we're getting close to the end, but if you have questions maybe that are too complicated or you don't want to ask in a public venue, that's fine too. You can email me or you can call me. But I really want you to think about this idea that what are the areas that are difficult. They're going to be difficult to integrate to this. I'm guessing touch. That's going to be a tough one. Maybe the idea of loved, or thinking about safety or violence, that might pose a whole nother area or open up a can of worms for your organizations, or I'm not sure, or maybe different responses for different patrons. I'm not sure, but I want you to have some access to some resources and tips that go with this. But go ahead and ask questions if you want to at any point, and as we go through the remaining slides. So first of all, some tips and awareness. Number 1, I mentioned this about in that handout. Include people with disabilities in the conversations in your libraries about this. It doesn't matter if we're talking about culture of compliance or culture of gentleness. We need to be more inclusive about people with disabilities, both in the service aspect and the employment aspect. Again, the handout that I had, the Nothing About Me Without Me, has some specific ways that you can do this. I want to give a shout out to the Vera Institute of Justice, who was a service provider for many years for me when I was working with people with disabilities at the intersection of sexual assault and disabilities. Vera is amazing. They have so many different initiatives. The one that's most relevant for this webinar and topic is the end abuse of people with disabilities. This little screenshot that you see is a map of the U.S., and those little flags or pins are collaborations that are either local, state, or nationally based of communities that are working, trying to help people with disabilities. And you can go and you can click on those, and some of them have resources, and I have resources. You can see Michigan has a couple of them. That's a ongoing collaboration that's going on in Michigan still. I have all kinds of different tools if you want for things like that, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And really just a note about that idea of collaboration. You need to find out who your community partners are and form relationships. And some of them are built in. Who are the people who are serving the people who we are serving? I want to give you some SWFLN demographics. I'm hoping you can see this. I know it's a little bit small, but I want you to think about this. These are the counties that SWFLN primarily serves. This is some Census Bureau data. And you can take a look at it a little bit longer or a little bit later, but I want you to just think about this, some of my interpretations of some of this data. In all of the counties but one, significantly higher percentages of people with over the age of 65. Okay, so I think that with age comes a greater likelihood of people with mobility, visual, and or hearing challenges, and thus a greater number of patrons who may need particular accommodations to access library materials, resources, or technology. I think that if you look at the statewide numbers and these individual county numbers, all of the counties but one, you are dealing with higher percentages than the statewide average of people with disabilities. Okay, I think it's important for all libraries in all counties in the state to provide resources, but it's particularly important for you. You might not be aware of the fact that you're dealing with, more people who have disabilities than the rest of the state. I think it's also an indication that the workshops and webinars that SWFLN has offered have been well attended. That they have an ongoing commitment to this. This indicates that you as library staff members also recognize that there's a substantial number of patrons that you're serving that have disabilities. You're also kind of looking at the poverty statistics. You are also serving a greater number of economically distressed counties, requiring, again, a greater diversity of offerings and support for your patrons. Something to think about. Again, these are added layers. If there's poverty layered on top of disability, and it usually is, again, it makes the problem even greater. And that's more attitudinal barriers. How do you perceive people with poverty or mental illness? And then kind of another one you may not have thought about is veterans. The Census Bureau indicates that there's over 125,000 veterans in these 5 counties that SWFLN serves, and there's often complexities there: PTSD, mobility challenge, depression resulting from their service, or they might need more specialized help in job seeking as they transition. These are all areas of overlap. Another thing to think about, there were 2 Florida statutes I saw fairly recently coming into Florida legislation that that talks about that might be intersections for you to help. There's a Disability History and Awareness Week in October. I didn't know that. I recently moved here, but maybe you knew that, maybe you didn't. This could be, chances for you to partner with libraries or create displays or something to that effect in your libraries that might help with this. Raising awareness, and again, you can take the ideas that you learned today of the culture of compliance and culture of gentleness, and hopefully use what you have to make some collaborations and with other organizations or schools that are using that. This one I thought a little bit, I don't want to say disturbing, but maybe a little bit. So here it is. The legislature further declares that in developing community-based programs and services for individuals with developmental disabilities, private businesses, not-for-profit corporations, units of local government, and other organizations capable, underlying mine, of providing needed services to clients in a cost-effective manner shall be given preference in lieu of state programs. Okay, so I mean, this to me sounds like the state is like saying, we can't handle this. It's up to you smaller organizations, and I think libraries fall in there. Again, how you define yourself might be different, but it's, it's the intent of the legislator, again, that all caretakers, and again, I want to just give you a side note, that's a poorly chosen word. Caretakers, you're not a caretaker, you're a caregiver. A caretaker is, I think you know, something else. But unrelated to individuals with development or developmental disabilities receiving care shall be of good moral character. Wow. Like, if that doesn't describe a librarian, I don't know what is. How can you not be, of good moral character and work in a library? You have so many things to deal with. But again, how is the state gonna like enforce this? Or I don't know. It's something to think about. Something to think about in any case. So those are some legislation there you have there. Just some general tips for interacting. Again, this is kind of an evolving section that I had at the first webinar, but this is a little bit different. Listen to the patron with a disability. Don't make assumptions about what that person can or cannot do. When speaking with a patron with a disability, talk directly to that person, not through his or her companion. Okay, so think about this, and it applies whether the person has a mobility impairment, a mental impairment, is blind, deaf, using an interpreter, doesn't matter. Just talk directly to the person. Extend common courtesies to patrons with disabilities as you would anyone else. Shake hands, business cards, treat with respect. Don't be ashamed of your attempt. Just try to make connections. If you're having trouble understanding what they're saying, ask a person to repeat rather than pretend you understand. Okay, the first is respectful and can lead to communication. The latter is belittling and can lead to embarrassment. Offer assistance, but wait until your offer is accepted before you help. It's okay to feel nervous or uncomfortable. It's okay to admit that. It's human. Okay, when you first encounter these situations, but always think person first instead of disability, and eventually you can relax with this. Again, the handouts that are here, and I think the 100 ways to support gentle and provide, to be gentle and provide care which is loving and supportive. There's some real simple phrases you can use, some simple ideas to use. And again, if you have specific questions about, well, I had this situation with a patron, how do I handle that, or what would you have done, or, can you give me any resources that could help me with this, particular disability, just let me know. I am a contact for you. I am a resource. Anything at all that you can, think about that came up with this, or that you want to, bounce off me, please feel free. Share this with your colleagues and coworkers, and again, extend myself as a resource to them as well. I love this quote, libraries play a catalytic role in the lives of people with disabilities by facilitating their full participation in society. I would love to be able to add to that and say their full and meaningful participation in society. We really want to go with that, and I think that is kind of the basis of this webinar. And keep calm and make it accessible. Keep asking the questions. Keep trying to be the best you can be for the people that you serve. And then I want to just show you real quick these, and those are the sources that we have. And for you, again, if you want more, once Erin posts this on the website, take a look at the ones I have, and then tell me what you want, and I will help in any way that I can. But with that, I'm going to leave the last 2 minutes for Aaron. I know that he's going to probably give you a sneak peek on what's up and coming, but I just want to thank you. I want to thank Diana for keeping up with me, for your ongoing commitment to trying to make things accessible. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Christine, for a wonderful webinar. Some information and a sneak peek of what is coming up. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, Be sure to join us next month on Friday, April 7th for Accessibility Points C is for Courage. Also, please join us next Wednesday, April 8th for Setting Priorities in Copy Cataloging, next Thursday, April 9th for the Future of Technology, on April 14th for our next Teacher Up Academy, and on April 17th for our next Diversity webinar. We encourage you all to look at the upcoming webinars and workshops in months ahead and hope you're all able to join us for future trainings. As always, please feel free to keep checking the CE calendar on the SWFLN website, our SWFLN Facebook page, or look for your message from the Florida Library listserv. Thank you everyone for attending and have a terrific weekend.